Before I get carried away with the wonders of putting the top cover back on, of course I've got to visit this exposure meter. You can see that the needle basically flops all around the place in there. I need to be in. Let's see if I can get the screws out of this cover without having to go to the horrible business of actually using some solvent to get these screws loose. No, they're going to come loose. Okay. It's possible the movement is off its pivots. Yeah, that's the case. If you look at that, you'll see that quite clearly the movement is not centered on that armature in there at all, on that. Okay, so first thing I need to do is do an electrical test and see if the movement is actually electrically complete. In other words, the circuit isn't broken. Because very frequently, of course, the coil on that meter goes open circuit. The wire is incredibly fine. You wouldn't believe how fine it is. You've only got to breathe on it and the stuff snaps. If that's broken, it's pointless me carrying on trying to repair that because I'm not going to get a result. But if electrically it's good, it'll be worth persevering, so I'll go and get a meter. Let's see if we get any continuity here. Not a sausage. So it's dead as a doornail. How would you go about getting a meter movement like that back on its pivots? Let's have a look at it. Okay, the first thing I'm going to do here is unsolder the connection at this point and this point. Then I can remove these two screws from the base and lift the movement out of there. I'll show you how that's done once I've got those wires unsoldered. Okay, so these two screws, let's get those loose. That screw is loose. This screw's loose too. Now that's pretty unusual. It may suggest, no, it doesn't make sense that someone would have been in here. The top cover of the meter was too well fitted for that to have been the case. That solder joint not broken there. Apparently not. I'll just deal with that. was looking for the adjustment screw for the pivot on this movement, and the screw's visible down here, but it's behind that shield. Let's pull that back out of the way. This screw here, now screwing it in typically pulls the pivots in, screwing it out typically raises the pivots. That's sealed up tight. It was let's see if this movement will sit on the pivot correctly. It may be that the pivot's actually snapped off the movement. That's a possibility. That's certainly not sitting on a pivot. The movement looks distorted. Yeah, it's got no pivot. The upper pivot on that movement's missing completely, so there's no danger you could do anything with that. That's done. That's toast. That can go back together for the sake of completeness, but it's never going to be a working meter. It wasn't going to anyway, because electrically it's open circuit. But even, we're not going to get it even to the stage where the movement is sitting correctly and the needle is dropping back to the rest position. We're not even going to see that happen. It's finished. The only way you could fix this would be to replace the meter in its entirety for all practical purposes. But that's an expensive mug's game these days, because the selenium cells are generally, possibly not entirely, but generally they are exhausted. They are failing. They do not have the appropriate output, and as a result of not having the proper output, they can never be accurate across a wide range of light values. You can fart around with them to make them appear to read correctly at one particular light value. That's not difficult, but that doesn't make them useful. If you set them up so that they read accurately on a bright sunny day, that's fine. But as soon as it's not a bright sunny day, you're not going to get correct readings. And if you know what the setting is going to be for a bright sunny day, you don't need an exposure meter. So I will clean up the glass on this. Well, it's a plastic window, just so that it's neat and tidy. Pop that connection wire back out of the way so it's not sticking up in the air. So normally, no, not even normally, but sometimes when meters get dropped and the movement comes off its pivots, they simply have jumped off the pivot. You have effectively a needle at the top and bottom of your movement, sitting in bearings, little cups for all practical purposes. Sometimes the camera gets a knock, the needle might jump right out of the pot, right out of the cup, and as a result the meter's sitting off centre and won't swing correctly. That was what I hoped to find in this case, but that was not the case. Clearly there was a problem with the meter being off its pivots, but in this case the pivot had snapped completely. That is probably the equivalent of a broken staff in a watch. Yeah, broken staff in the watch movement would be the same sort of problem. Right. Well, a follower needle follows, but it's not following anything useful. Okay. That dial's a bit stiff. See if I can pop that off there and clean that. Just using the back of my scalpel there to push back that clip. And here, this will just be stiff from dried out grease and the dust and grit that have become embedded in that grease. A wipe of molybdenum paste around the centre, around that cam surface, that'll do. So what you do if you're desperate to have an apparently working meter in your camera and the meter doesn't work, well, really your only option is to pillage the meter out of an organ donor, which means buying another camera cheap enough to make it worth the effort and stealing the meter from it. Given that it's unlikely you're going to get a meter that works accurately out of the whole business, you're just doing it for the sake of having something in the cupboard that looks to the uneducated to be a fully working example. Here I'm just putting a touch of lacquer in there so that screw can't back out. Not that it's particularly prone to it, but sometimes things come loose. Put a touch of grease there. What do we want here? The return spring, and here's the film release lever. I was put a wipe of molybdenum post through the centre of that so it moves smoothly on its post. They never move very smoothly on their post. It's a lousy design, it's just a dogleg arrangement. This is not over the top of its post, so it means that whenever you put pressure on here, things are flexing, stuff doesn't want to go round corners. They don't work well. They never worked well. They were always a design limitation. In order for something like that release button to work well, you would need the button to be directly in line with the post. And I presume that was difficult enough that they didn't want to do it. Now, where's that gone? So the closing up of the camera body, making sure all the dust is off all the surfaces, holding my finger on the meter so it doesn't move while I'm trying to wriggle the top cover in place, because that little rubber pad is busy trying to shift. Now I want to check the frame counter to see where it lines up, because I've had the cocking rack out and I might not have put it back in exactly the same position. So I want to see if those numbers line up, whether they're central. It's moving just past the number. So I want to move the adjusting screw in slightly. And try that. I was looking out, you see nothing. That's better. Let's see what that number looks like now. Yeah, that's centred up quite well there now. We'll call that a win. Two chrome plated screws at this end of the top cover, and all these screws were loose when I started, weren't they? One at this end of the top cover, doesn't want to pick up. That's better. That bracket's a bit distorted, of course, from having been dropped. Check that the film release and the shutter release buttons work smoothly. They do. That's good. The rewind. The rewind knob can go on once it's been cleaned. A lot of dust and dirt in here. Was that loose when I started? I can't remember now. I think it was. And the spring for that is here, and the screw for that is here, and the tool for tightening it is here. Put that on there. Take our wavy washer, put some grease on it, the rewind knob over the top, run the screw down, do that up tight, check that the film reminder dial will move. It will. Here's the camera. I've got the spacer on the top of the rewind. Run that down, pull it up to full height, something through the fork of the rewind. That's it. The meter dial. This, of course, now we're getting deeply into decorative territory. Find all these pieces. There's the last little washer there. Right, clean this up. Okay, that's enough pieces. Start here. The knob only goes on in one position. It picks up, there's two small blobs on here and they go into the two small blob holes on the top there. Then we have the wavy washer, which I'll apply some synthetic grease to. That sits on the top right there. Then we have our film speed dial. Then we have this piece, the register for the ASA settings if you like. Then we have another wavy washer, a small one. Then we have the chrome plated screw. I'll get the screw started. I'll do that up very lightly. Normally if you turn the dial clockwise as far as it will go, so the 18 and the EV scale is over this way. This is the ASA scale here, it's got 1300 on it. This little white line, which is currently up against the 18, that needs to roll round till it's between 16 and 17. I'll do that to screw up a bit tighter so things don't work loose. There are two tiny holes in that black disc, so I can engage a tool in there and rotate this clockwise till that white line's between 16 and 17. Now if that had been a good working camera with a good working meter, that would have been the appropriate place to set that and everything would have been good. Of course in this case the meter's dead, so it's a moot point. But that's just there for your information. So the follower needle moves nice and smoothly now. The exposure meter will never ride again. But that's the camera body ready to go. And I better do the shutter.